Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Unit 1 of the Lunch and Learn series. Tim Baker's my name and I'll be working with you throughout the Lunch and Learn series. Now, just a few housekeeping things before we launch into topic 1. Now, over on the right-hand side, you'll notice a little box called Questions. Could I just ask you to click on that and just type in the word clear? So that lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thank you, John. That's great. Anyone else? Thanks, Marcia. Thanks, Jenna. Welcome to Jenna. Okay. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bernadette. All right, looks like I am coming across loud and clear. So welcome everyone. We've got people from all over the world who are tuning in. So in some places of the world it's early evening, and other places of the world it's no doubt morning. And here in Brisbane, Australia, it's 12 midday, which is of course lunchtime. So it may not be lunch and learn for wherever you are. But anyway, welcome, and I'm glad I'm coming across loud and clear. Now, the other bit of housekeeping is that you will receive a copy of these slides and a recording at the end of the presentation. So just relax, you don't need to worry about notes. You'll get all of these things sent to you hopefully this afternoon, or in my time at least. So you'll get a copy of all of that as well. Now, the other piece of housekeeping that's very important is that if you've got a question or you've got a comment or an observation that you'd like to make throughout the series, please do exactly what you did when you typed in the word clear. In other words, I want you to write down your question when you think about it. Don't wait till the end, because what happens at the end is we have this awkward pause while everybody waits to remember what question they want to ask. So my comment is just type them in as soon as you think about them. And I'm the only one that gets to see those questions. So what happens is as soon as I see them, I respond to them. Or as soon as I can, I respond to them. So please, that's the whole opportunity. And this is a way of actually making this as interactive as possible. All right, so that's about it. Now, the only other issue is, of course, that at the end of each session, I give you some homework to do. So you go off and try some very practical things. And I'm always encouraging you to send me an email. You can see on the screen there, you've got my email address. So if you want to tell me, what your trials and tribulations are, your war stories, whatever they are, send me an email. That's a good opportunity to do that in between sessions, and I'm more than happy to respond to that. All right, so let's get underway. Now, of course, Unit 1 today is looking at the characteristics of high-performing teams. It's a good place to start if we're talking about team development. But before we do that, let's just take a quick glance at the program in general and understand what we're covering here. Now, I'm going to be covering the characteristics of high-performing teams today. When we meet, and we usually meet fortnightly, in fact, I think I've spaced it out every fortnight we meet. In Unit 2, we'll look at the 4 stages of team development. Now, some of you are team leaders in an very early stage in your team development, and others, of course, have got well-established teams. So it's a good opportunity for you to have a look at what stage of development you're in. This is based on Bruce Tuckman's work, which some of you would be familiar with, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to look at your team in a different light. In session 3, we're going to look at tools for leading teams, and really what I guess I'm going to be talking about there is you as the team leader. And this is about you trying different approaches for different situations with different folk. So this is about you using different approaches in the circumstances that you're absolutely in. So sometimes you have to be autocratic. There are other times when you've got to be very laissez-faire and laid back. Other times you've got to take the team with you. So let's look at some of those opportunities and where they might arise. In Unit 4, we're going to look at the roles that people play in teams, and this comes from Meredith Belbin's work. Now, Meredith Belbin actually was male, and Dr. Belbin was the first academic that came up with the notion that people, when they actually congregate together in a team environment, will have a tendency, often subconsciously, to play certain roles. So we'll actually have a look at that and understand what those roles are. And we may well have somebody join us as a guest speaker in that unit with a bit of luck. In Unit 5, it'll be the only diagnostic you have to complete in the series. So I'm going to send you out a link, and it's a conflict resolution diagnostic. And what it'll do is it'll show you your preferred style of dealing with conflict. And we've all got a preferred style of dealing with conflict. Sometimes we're not aware of it. Other times we're acutely aware of it. So what that diagnostic will do is show you how you like to operate or how you like to deal with conflict and negotiation. Because let's face it, if you're a team leader, you're going to be faced with conflict and negotiation quite a fair bit of your time. So getting flexible and good at it is critically important to your success as a team leader. And the very last unit we'll look at, and this will be next year, will be developing team culture. So a lot of people say, how do I develop a team culture? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're the team leader of a team, your team already has a culture. It's just really a question of whether the culture is helpful or not. So it's about creating and developing positive cultures in teams, and that's what we'll focus on in Unit 6. So folks, that's pretty much the process and how we intend to go and travel through. We've had some excellent feedback on the series so far, so strap yourself in. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the ride. And as I've said before, to make this as interactive as possible, you just type in your questions over in the question box. I can't unmute everybody. You can imagine that'll cause chaos. So this is the next best thing for you to contribute via the questioning box there. All right, so let's look at what we're covering today, specifically in Unit 1. Well, first of all, the question is, what are these 8 characteristics of high-performing teams? So let's actually have a look at these. You're very fortunate because I'm in the middle of writing my 9th book at the moment, and I'm up to chapter 7. And the book's got a working title of the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. So you will be one of the very few select groups that will actually get to see firsthand what my model is and what these 8 characteristics are. We'll actually look at some examples of high-performing teams. In fact, I'm going to ask you to come up with some examples very shortly in perhaps the sporting world of high-performing teams. And then, of course, we're going to look at some tools that'll help you create a high-performing team. So the homework, as you can imagine, out of today's session will be very much to apply one of the characteristics, or at least one, if not 2 or 3, to your team. And then by doing that, you will start to move towards becoming a high-performing team. Irrespective of where you are right now, you can certainly have the opportunity to do that. All right, so let me ask you a question now, and I'm wanting you to type in the question box the answer to this question. I want you to think about some examples of high-performing teams in the world of sport. So we're looking at team sports, and I'd like you to type in, I may not be an authority on the team that you mentioned, but I'd be keen for you to type in a team that you believe, at least now, perhaps for an extended period of time, has been a high-performing team. Does anyone want to have a go at that? Just type in the question box the name of a team. There are no wrong answers. Just give me some glimpses of why they're high-performing. All right, Jack talks about I'll just get to Jack in a minute. John talks about the New England Patriots. So John's joining us from the United States. We Aussies might not know too much about that, but I tell you what, we do get the American football on telly, and it's becoming very popular here in Australia. So that's an interesting perspective. I'll have to take your word for it, John. The Kookaburras, they won the Commonwealth Games gold medal, Jenna. Absolutely, yes. I can talk more about that. Yeah, the Kookaburras were brilliant in the female hockey championships, winning the gold medal in the Olympics, Commonwealth Games, I should say. Anyone else? Okay, state of origin team, says Chris. Absolutely. And which team are we talking about? The Mighty Maroons, of course. So, yep, Chris, you're right. State of Origin Queensland team, what was it, 8 in a row or something like that they won, which was absolutely phenomenal. We've obviously got a Kiwi here, a New Zealander, who talks about the mighty All Blacks. And yes, they are a top team. And I think they've got a winning ratio of something like 85%, which is phenomenal. So great. We've obviously got things in mind here. So that's brilliant. Thanks, guys. So I'm not going to ask you necessarily to comment on this, but I want you to reflect on what are those characteristics that make these teams high performing. So what are they actually doing? Because all of those examples are high performing. So what do they actually do? So let's dive in and have a look at these 8 characteristics of high performing teams and have an understanding of what they mean in terms of our own team. While I go through this model with you, which will come up on, there it is, it's up on your screen now. As I go through this model, I'd like you to have a think about your own team and consider how you're performing as a team in this model. Now, this is my model that I've adapted. I'll give you an example of what happened. I wrote an article on LinkedIn, and I called it the 8 characteristics of high performing teams, and this was the model, which is my model. And I was basically asking people for feedback, and have I got the right characteristics? Am I missing any? What do you think about the characteristics I've got? And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. In fact, I got 45,000 responses or 45,000 clicks on the article. And I rang my publisher in the UK, and I said to them, I think we've got a book here. And the publisher was quite keen to consider that on the basis of the volume of interest in this particular model. So I'm going to work my way around clockwise, starting at 12 o'clock, and just give you a quick overview of each. And then once I've done each of these, I'm then going to spend a bit of time talking about each and give you a couple of practical things that you can do to help you build capacity around these 8 characteristics. Now, a couple of things about the model. Let me ask you the question. What do you notice about the model? What's the obvious thing that comes up? Anyone like to type in something there? What is the key characteristic you notice about the model? Obviously, there are 8 characteristics, but beyond that, what do you notice? Anyone want to have a go at that? So what does that model show you? All right. Yeah, exactly, Chris, exactly. Interconnectedness between the elements. Precisely. So do you want the good news and the bad news? Well, the good news is this, that if you work on one of these characteristics in your team, it's highly likely that it's going to impact positively on other characteristics in the team. So that's the good news. So they are all interrelated. They are, and let me give you an example of what I mean by that. In order to build trust, you need to have a purpose, a clear purpose of what you're doing. So there are 2 characteristics that go hand in hand, and so forth and so on. So there's all of these interconnectedness or issues that Chris mentioned before. Now, the bad news, the bad news is this: if one of these characteristics is suffering, it's likely that it's going to have an impact on other characteristics in the team. This is water, by the way, not vodka. And so these things will have characteristics on the other elements. Now, so if you're lacking in one, it's likely you'll be lacking in several. So they are all interconnected. Now let's go around the 8 quickly. Now up the top there, the very first one that you can see is pursuing purpose. All great teams have a purpose. Now in the sporting world, the purpose is pretty straightforward, and that is to win the game. All right, and obviously if you're winning more games than losing, then you're performing reasonably well. And in the All Blacks case, 85% of their performances end in a win. And for my overseas colleagues who may not know much about All Blacks, All Blacks is the New Zealand rugby team, and it wins about 85% of its games. There's only a population of about 4 million people in New Zealand, and yet they're able to create a rugby team that's almost invincible. Anyway, more about that later perhaps. So all teams need a purpose. Now, all teams don't work in a vacuum, so they need to be able to manage their stakeholders. And their stakeholders could be internal to the organisation, in other words, another department, or they could be external to the organisation, such as a customer. But nevertheless, teams have got to be able to manage those stakeholders, because if they don't manage those stakeholders, it's very hard to do your job. Building trust is really critically important in any team. You can lose trust very quickly, can't you? You can lose it very quickly. You just have to promise something and not deliver, and people start doubting you. On the other hand, it takes quite a long time to build up a high level of trust in a team. So it is a tough task to do that. So you might want to reflect on your own team and just think for a moment, what do you think might be the level of trust, generally speaking, in the team? And I'm not necessarily talking about trust as far as you're concerned. I'm talking about trust in terms of how the rest of the team get on, the relationships in the team, and so forth and so on. So that's really, really important. The next one is shared leadership. Now, shared leadership is a concept where the team leader, being you, of course, are sharing the baton of leadership. So at the right time, in the right way, with the right person, you defer to them. So, for example, somebody in your team who might be very good at structuring things, you might defer the conversation to them to allow them to come up with a response or an answer. Being agile, well, agile is a buzzword at the moment, isn't it? Everybody needs to be agile in this very fast VUCA world that we live in. And teams are no different, of course, and teams need to be agile. They need to be able to flex and maneuver depending on the circumstances they're in and what they're facing at the time. So it becomes very important not to be set in your ways, and to have the old adage that we always do things this way is probably not terribly advantageous to a high-performing team. Renovating systems, and what I mean by that is constantly looking at the way you operate in a team. What systems do you use? Are they helpful? Are they unhelpful? How can we change and develop them to make them even more effective? Utilising diversity. It's interesting in our society, isn't it? It doesn't matter where you are in the world, you'd be aware that diversity and equity and merit-based selection and all of these concepts are quite important in the Western world. And we're hearing lots and lots of commentary about this. But what I find interesting is that we are not terribly tolerant to the way people think. In other words, I think the next big thing that's going to occur in society is a thinking around diversity of thinking. All of us come to the table thinking differently about problems. And if we can harness that different way of thinking, we're going to be more effective. So when I talk about utilising diversity, I'm not necessarily talking about cultural diversity here or male and female. I'm talking about diversity in terms of the way people think and operate and behave in teams. And of course, a team has to be continuously learning and growing. And if you look at those sporting teams that you indicated earlier, one of those characteristics is they're always trying to improve and better their own performance. And they're never satisfied with the result that they've got. So continuous learning is critically important. Now, are there other characteristics of high-performing teams? I dare say there are, but for the time being, these are the 8 that I've come up with that I think are critically important. So you might want to think about those as in terms of incorporating those characteristics into your teams as much as you can. All right, so let's now break it down. What I'm going to do now is look at each of those in a bit more detail and talk about some of the things that you can do that are very practical that can help you develop that characteristic. Now, the first characteristic at 12 noon is a sense of purpose, all right? So every team that I know that's high performing has a crystal clear sense of purpose and direction. They know what they're doing, they know how to do it, they know how they're going, they know how they're performing, and so forth and so on. At the end of the day, you as the team leader have got to set clear expectations of what you expect of the people in your team. Now, that might sound pretty straightforward to you, but I'll guarantee to you that if you did nothing else out of today but just be very crystal clear about the expectations you have of your team, you'll go a long way to building trust. You'll go a long way to doing lots of things that are very effective in your team. But here's the problem. Setting expectations sounds like such a simple concept, but it's not. And let me show you what I mean by that. This slide that'll come up very shortly suggests that there it is now. You've got 7 questions on managing expectation. Now, if you think about it, if you don't respond positively to any of these 7 questions, it's likely that the team, or at least individuals in the team, will not be clear about the expectations. Let me go through them with you. The very first question that you as a leader have to be able to answer is, what are my expectations as a leader? Let me ask you this, are you crystal clear about the expectations that you have of your team? Now, sounds very tempting to say yes to that, but if I went up to one of your team members and I said to them, what are the values that are critically important for your team leader? Would they be able to rattle them off? Would you be satisfied with their answer? Would they get it right? So expectations are significantly important, and it's not just expectations around tasks. But nevertheless, if you're not clear in your mind about what you expect of other people, there's no way in the world you're going to be able to manage expectations, because you're not even clear what the expectations are. So let's assume that you are clear about that. The next question you've got to ask yourself is this: have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, again, you might be sitting there thinking, well, of course I have. I do it every team meeting. I do it in the corridor. I explain to people all the time what's expected of them. Now, it is important here that you do this regularly and what I call persistent and consistent. So you do it, the same message comes across, but you do it over and over again, moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, crisis by crisis. It never ends. You've got to communicate expectations clearly to your team in all sorts of circumstances. So don't think I just do it once and that's enough, because people aren't always good listeners. So you've got to continually communicate and think of creative ways of doing that. So let's assume you're clear about your expectations. Let's assume that you have communicated those expectations regularly to your team. The next big hurdle you've got to face is, do they understand what your expectations are? Now, it's all very well you explaining it, communicating it, but do people actually understand the why? Do they know why you expect them to do things in a certain way? Do they know why this process needs to be followed the way it is? Do they know what the consequences are of not doing this correctly in terms of the client or the customer? Do they know the context behind the expectations that you have? Because if they don't, they may not value those expectations particularly high. So spend a bit of time to explain the why, and don't assume that other people know. They often don't. Now, let's assume you're clear about your expectations. Let's assume that you've communicated them, and let's assume that people actually understand your expectations. Surely that would be the end of it, would it not? Not quite. The fourth question is this: do your team accept your expectations? right? So they might understand them, but the question then is, do they accept them? Now, I see this a lot in sales teams, that the team leader or the sales director or manager will set the budget for the next year extremely high. And what their rationale is they're thinking, if I set it that high, then maybe people will get halfway. But the problem is that the person knows that you're setting it unrealistically high, and of course they don't accept it. And if they don't accept it because they don't think it's realistic, it's likely they're not going to put too much energy into trying to achieve it. So be realistic about your expectations and make sure that people accept and embrace them as such. Because if they don't, there's a very good chance they won't do what they need to do, or what you want them to do at least. So let's assume you're clear about your expectations. Let's assume you've communicated. Let's assume they understand them, and let's assume they accept them. Surely that's the end of it. No, it's not. The next question is, are they committed? Now, there's a good chance they will be committed if they meet the first 4 criteria, but are they committed to meeting your expectations? Don't know. But the important thing, and a very important question that you can ask your team members, is when you're talking to them about meeting expectations, is actually ask them for their commitment. That's right, you actually ask them for their commitment. You actually say to them, can I get your commitment? And of course, you want a nod or a grunt, or even better still, a yes. Now, if you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, then it's highly likely that people will commit. But you have to ask for that commitment, because if you assume that you're going to get that commitment, you could be very disappointed in the long run. So surely that's the end of it, isn't it? No, there's 2 more key questions. Do my team member know how they're performing against those expectations? Are you giving regular and fearless feedback to your team? Are you giving positive and negative feedback to your team about when they meet the crossbar? Say in high jumps, or are people well and truly aware of whether they're meeting your expectations? And I have to say to you, in this part of the world, in Australia, Australian leaders are very, very poor at giving feedback on performance. That's been demonstrated through research. There's a lot of theories as to why that is, but we Aussies aren't particularly good at this. So it is important for you to give people feedback regularly. Now, if you're giving people feedback, surely that would be enough, wouldn't it? No, one last hurdle. The last hurdle is, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, the truth of the matter is that there are lots and lots of barriers inside your organisation and outside your organisation as well that will get in the way of people achieving success. So your job as a team leader is to remove those barriers, or at least minimise those distractions, so that people can get on and perform at a high level. So your job is to try to remove all the impediments. Let me give you a good example. If you had an expectation that one of your team would complete one of their reports by close of business Friday and they didn't, and then you asked them why, and you said, because I didn't get information from another part of the organisation fast enough, then one of your potential inputs could be to go and talk to the team leader in the other team and make sure that your team receives timely information, so that your team members can actually follow through on your expectations. All right, so there are 7 things, and you've got to tick all of those boxes in order to get people to work towards purpose. Let's move on. The next characteristic is open communication. How often have you heard people say, you'll get told on a need-to-know basis, or no news is good news? What they're basically saying is, we're not going to be open with you. We'll only be open with you when we choose to be. What's important for you is to make sure you've got open communication in your teams. How do you do that? Well, this framework, which I'm proud to say has now taken off all over the world, the 5 conversations framework, really does give you a framework. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to do this, but I'm just showing you that you should be having regular one-on-one get-togethers and catch-ups, check-ins, whatever you want to call it, with each of your team members regularly. It builds and strengthens trust. It improves engagement. It helps people to align their expectations with yours. And in this little approach here that I use, I've got 5 different themes in these conversations. And what I suggest to people in teams is that they have one of these conversations once a month, as you can see on the left-hand side, one of these conversations once a month with each team member. Now, it's not a huge ask before you get concerned about the time it's going to take. These conversations should take no more than 15 minutes. And the conversation is thematically based, and the questions are available for people. And the idea is that they go ahead and they use that framework to help them. Sorry, Chris, I'll just come back. Chris has just asked a question, recommitment question, perhaps also a supplementary question if someone says yes, what might be the impact on your ongoing commitment? If they say no, ask what needs to change so that you could get commitment. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's the point. By asking people for their commitment, it's quite possible that they can't give you commitment. Now, if they can't give you commitment, that's worthy of a conversation, is it not? Because you'd rather know at that point than later on when they've disappointed you. So, good point. So, if you can't get people's commitment, the question is to ask why not. Thanks, Chris. Great contribution. Coming back to the 5 conversations framework, you can see that we have a climate review, which is pretty much people's job satisfaction, morale, communication generally, and that kind of thing. The next month, you have a conversation with your team members about their strengths and innate talents. There's a high correlation between what people enjoy at work and what they're good at. The research demonstrates that clearly. So what you've got to do is get people to talk about what they enjoy doing and think about how you as a team leader can harness that, perhaps to greater advantage by getting people to do more of that in the team. Month number 3 is the opportunities for growth. There's things that we've all got to work on, and again, you ask the team member to come to that conversation having thought about one particular area that they themselves could work on and what you can do as their coach. Out of conversation 2 and 3, you end up with a learning and development conversation in month 4, and that's really to talk about ways and means that you can assist that person to harness the strengths that they talked about and also to overcome the opportunities for growth. This may not be about sending people off to courses or whatever. It could well be just coaching them, showing them how to do something or whatever. There are lots of ways of doing that. And the last conversation is innovation and continuous improvement. So this is a conversation around how we can improve our workplace. So the difference between 4 and 5 is 4 is about themselves, 5 is about the workplace. Now, I can assure you, if you got into the pattern of doing that framework over a 5-month period, you would see things dramatically improve. So it's a thought. You can actually go through and use that as a process. That will do what I'm suggesting is open communication, which of course is the second category we're looking at. All right, so it had to come up sooner or later, and we're coming up right now on your screen, and that's trust. So how do we build trust and mutual respect? It's not an easy thing to do, as I said at the outset. There are a lot of concepts and variables that are involved in trust, but have a look at some of these on this screen. It'll come up shortly on the screen. The reality is trust has many different components to it. And it's not a fad, it's not a technique, it's not some framework. You have to be doing all of these things reasonably well most of the time to have a high level of trust. And even when you do that, some people aren't terribly trusting. So you need to be sincere. Well, I usually prefer to use the term authentic. So you're authentic. What people see is what they get. You need to be reliable. If you promise to do something and you don't follow through, you've just eroded your trust. You've just eroded the credibility. You need to show a commitment. So if you're not putting in and building teams and leading the way you should, then people's energy level drops away. You need integrity, so practice what you preach. It is important as a team leader to demonstrate that you've got some degree of competence in the technical area of what you're doing. People will excuse you if you're new to a team leader role and you need to learn the skills of being a leader, but they won't necessarily excuse you if they feel that your technical skills are found wanting. And so that becomes quite important. And consistency. If people see that you're very consistent and very predictable, that is a pattern that people pursue, and that's how they'll make impressions or gain impressions about your level of trust by the degree to which you are consistent. So you need all those balls in the air, folks, in order to develop trust with your people. And as I said earlier on, you can lose it in a flash, and it'll take you a period of time to gain it as well. So don't despair if you feel that the trust level in the team between you and the team isn't terribly high. Then you can start right now and you can start building a plan to build some credibility and trust. If you feel that there are two members that don't get on well and there's no trust between them, then be proactive and pull them aside and have a conversation with them both, explaining to them the importance of them working together and what you can do to remove any barriers that might get in the way of building up a professional trust between those two people. So it's a very important topic to get right. Now, situational leadership. If we look at shared leadership, I would argue, and we're going to spend quite a lot of time on this, as I said earlier, in Unit 3. But let's have a look at the situation. I'm sure you've all seen this. This is Blanchard's situational leadership model. I'm not going to go through it in great detail because we'll be doing all that in session 3, Unit 3. But my point is that you need to vary your leadership style depending on two variables: the situation that you're in and the people that you're leading. So you have to vary it. In fact, I should be able to walk up to any of your team members and ask them which of these 4 leadership styles do you exhibit most of the time: delegating, supporting, coaching, directing. And the answer I want from your team members is actually he or she uses all 4 depending on the circumstances they're in. And that would be the right answer. That's what I'd want to hear. In other words, you haven't been typecast as a directing type leader or a supporting type leader, because not all situations require directing and supporting. So vary your leadership style depending on the circumstances. And if you make a mistake, then just go to a plan B. It's as simple as that. And just make the shift, and you'll realize that it could be done in a better way. Now, the other thing, this isn't showing up on your slide, is it? Let me go back a bit. Let me just go back. Excuse me for a moment. Oop, here we go. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So, how do we, how do we continuously improve? Well, let's have a look at some dimensions in your team that might be open to continuous improvement. I've done this little model up for you, and some of these things will be more relevant than others, and you might want to consider which are relevant to your team. But it's a great way to be able to look through the lens of continuous improvement in your team. The difference between innovation and continuous improvement is reasonably simple. Innovation is creating something out of nothing, whereas continuous improvement is building and developing and bettering something that's already there. So, how can you improve the quality of the service or the product that you produce? How can you reduce the time it takes to do some of the things that you do in your team? How can you reduce the costs associated with the business that you are involved in? The cost could also mean time. How can I increase the output? So how can we get more output, perhaps for the same input? How can I increase, and those of you working with outdoor teams, how can I increase safety to make sure that our environment is safer than it currently is? How can I meet deadlines more effectively, or how can I get my team members to meet deadlines more effectively? How can I enhance interpersonal cooperation with my team members, and also interpersonal cooperation between your team and other teams? Sometimes it might be good to get your team and the other team in a room and try and sort out how you might work more effectively together, how you might communicate better with each other. That can be quite a useful exercise. And how can I streamline our systems and processes to make sure that they're still relevant and they're up to date and people are using them effectively? Now, I think that's a great criteria, and I think that you should be encouraging your team members genuinely to be coming forward with ideas and ways of making your workplace more innovative and continuously improving. All right, so any questions, guys? You know what to do. Type them in the question box and I'm happy to answer them, or any comments or observations you've got, please do the same. Let's keep moving. Now, another important thing is to manage the differences in your team. Now, the reality is your team, there are people in your team who have different ways of doing things. There are some strengths, some opportunities for growth. Now, how can you harness and utilize that more effectively? Well, the best way to do that is what we call strength-based leadership. In other words, instead of us banging on about what people are no good at, how about we concentrate our efforts on the things that people are good at? How about we try and harness the positives that occur in your team, some of the innate talents that people have got. So, for example, it might not be a task that people do. Somebody might have a really good way of being able to chop things up into manageable bite-sized pieces. And what about, could we possibly get them to summarize the meeting? Could we possibly get them to give a bit of a summary at the end of the meeting of what they've actually heard and some of the key steps that have come out? I don't mean take the minutes, I mean just actually literally give a summary. Or some people are very good at breaking the ice. Could we defer to them for a bit of a joke of the week? Or some people are very good at building rapport up with clients. How do we utilize our differences in our team to greater effect is the key question. Now, when we get to Unit 4, we're going to look at the different ways that people can offer to bring strengths to the workplace. And we're going to use the team management profile model, which I'm well and truly across, as an example. But there are many, many team role diagnostics that are out there. This is just one of many, but at the end of the day, what it does is it gives everyone a label or an opportunity to consider what they can offer the team in its totality. So this is very, very effective. So we need to manage diversity, and the way to do that, of course, is to build on people's strengths. Now, what about flexibility and being adaptable? All teams have to be flexible. All teams have to be adaptable. How do we do this. Now, what I suggest is this exercise, and I think it's a very, very good little exercise, highly underrated, that you might like to do with your team. So what you do is simply this. You get your team together, say at the next meeting, it can be at any time, and you find a whiteboard, and on that whiteboard you draw 2 lines down the page. Now these 2 lines are you're going to put something in these 3 spaces. Now what the 2 lines represent is that you'll find that on your left hand, start with the left hand side, and what you ask your team then on the left hand side is, what are all the things that we do and we attend to in this team that have to be done by the book? So what are all the things where we have no option but to follow a system? And then you fill out that list, and you'll find that there'll be quite a long list, particularly if you're a public sector agency, so you're working in the public sector. It's highly likely that you'll have lots of things because you're working in a regulatory environment. But businesses also have things that have got to be done by the letter. So you fill that list out. Then you go to the other side and you ask the question, what are all the things where each of us has a complete freedom to make a decision about how we tackle something? All right, so what are all those things where we don't have any systems necessarily, but we've just got to tackle them anyway? Now that list's not going to be as long, but you just keep pushing and looking for opportunities to consider that. Now the middle space here that we haven't touched on, this is the space where you ask people the question, what are all the things where we could either follow the system or we can, be quite enterprising and do things our own way. So we can fluctuate between following the systems and doing our own thing. And you might find you'll need to prompt people by giving them examples there. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that you are trying to give people a license to work on the things that are on the right-hand side, where they have complete and utter freedom to make decisions. And I would also suggest that the things in the middle could well be open at different times, where people back themselves and go ahead and do what they need to do rather than following the system. Okay, so as you can see on the screen there, you can see that there are decisions that have to follow a process. Are we clear about what they are? I hope so. But they're decisions that can either be following a process or can be initiated, right? Some people here in this case will often default back to the a process because they're too afraid of the consequences of messing up by being entrepreneurial. And then here we've got, of course, where people can show complete initiative. So if you have that exercise in your team, you'll find that people will feel calmer and clearer about what they need to do and where they need to be more adaptable and flexible. Okay, moving around now we're up to continuous learning. Now, I think the most powerful way to be able to implement continuous learning in your team is by using the concept called an after-action review. Now, most military organisations, at least in the Western world, will use an after-action review. So after the military have done an assignment, whether it's whatever it might be, they'll often sit around and do what's commonly called a debrief, and they'll actually answer 3 key questions. They'll answer the questions of 1, what went well? Now, no matter whether it was a disaster or not, something would have gone well. So we ask the question, what went well? The second question we ask is, what did not go well? So even if it was an absolute success, there's always something that didn't go according to plan or as well as it probably could. So we get the whole team embraced in this conversation. And then the final question that you ask is, what will we do differently next time? Now, if you just get used to asking those 3 questions at the end of every project, every critical incident, every circumstance where there is a start and finish of something. You can do this individually as well. So if you can actually do this in the corridor, talking to somebody who's just completed a task. You can actually say, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what did you learn personally from that? You see, so it's a very powerful way of us being able to generate a learning culture. Now, you'll find that whatever people commit to at the end, they will commit to, because of the old issue is people won't argue with their own data, or people won't argue with their own data, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And the key thing there is that they'll be committed to the learnings out of it because they themselves came up with the learnings. And Peter Senge, the great organisational psychologist, said that he felt, at least, that the after action review, or the AAR, was one of the most powerful organisational learning methods yet devised. That's high praise from somebody such as Peter Senge. So you might want to consider using that as an opportunity of gaining a continuous improvement culture in your workplace. It works extremely well, and I'd strongly recommend that you adhere to that. All right, so folks, do we have any questions before I hit you up for some homework? Do anyone got any comments, any observations, any experiences in teams that they've worked in where something didn't quite work, or something that I haven't mentioned did work? Go for your life. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Perhaps while you're thinking about that, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. And now, what I'm going to propose is this, that I want you to go back to the model, because you'll receive the slides and the recording hopefully this afternoon. That's the plan, at least. And you'll receive them. And when you receive them, what I'd like you to do is to have a look at the model. And I'd like you to take one of those 8 characteristics. You pick whichever one you want, and I'd like you to then go, something that sparked your interest, basically. And then I'd like you to do something. I actually want you to try something new in your team that will give expression to that characteristic. All right? So if it's about open communication, for example, then I want you to implement the 5 conversations framework. Or if you want to create a continuous learning culture, I want you to start using an after-action review after every project. I want you to do something deliberately that will work on that. And remember the good news out of all this? If you work on one of these characteristics, you will find that it'll have a payoff with other characteristics. In other words, you'll find that there'll be other things in your team that will be, that will be positively influenced by you working on one characteristic. Now, if you don't do anything different, let me tell you, nothing will change. And whilst you might find this lunch and learning series very entertaining, you may not actually get anything out of it in terms of changing your team culture. So that's your homework. So as I suggested to you earlier, can I get your commitment? Can I get your commitment to do your homework and to complete it according to what I suggest? Because if you do that, you'll get some good results. Now, finally, before we sign off, and I can see that I think people will warm up as you get used to lunch and learn and get used to my voice and my who I am and all that kind of stuff. I think you'll find people will start warming up and contributing more in the lunch and learn. I certainly want you to do that. But now the next time we meet, which of course will be in 2 weeks' time, we're going to look at the 4 stages of team development. We're actually going to look at the stages of forming, storming, norming and performing, which are the 4 stages that Bruce Tuckman came up with in his very famous team development model. And more importantly, we're going to look at how you can move your team on from whatever stage they're in to the next stage, and to the stage where they're ultimately successful, which is the performing stage. And then, of course, I won't go into great detail what we're doing in units 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so that's pretty much it from me, folks. I don't have anything else I want to add. As I say, these are short and sharp. They go for an hour, and I've enjoyed my first session with you. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you will do your homework. And I want to wish you a really wonderful weekend wherever you are. And I would say to you, thank you for your involvement, and I wish you all the very best. And thank you and goodbye.